Welcome back to my channel Shattered Trust Stories. It had always been a love story that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. I still remember the first time I laid eyes on Sarah, in a little coffee shop tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. She was sitting by the window, her gaze lost in the pages of a book, her hair falling in soft waves around her face. It wasn't the sort of moment where I could say I knew right away that she was the one. No, it was something subtler than that, something in the way she smiled when she caught me staring, a smile that reached her eyes and felt like a welcome into something unknown but comforting. That we fell fast, just like you do when you're in your mid-20s, filled with hope and a sense that the future is nothing but open doors. Our weekends were filled with late-night talks and early morning walks. There were no secrets, no walls. I told her everything about my life, about my family, my past, my ambitions. She did the same, and I could see in her eyes that she trusted me, as if I were the first person who truly understood her. We got married after 2 years of dating. The ceremony was small but beautiful, surrounded by close friends and family. It felt like the beginning of forever. After all, we had built something so strong, so undeniable. In the early days of our marriage, it felt like we were on top of the world. Our relationship was a constant source of joy, and we shared the same dreams of travel, building a family, and growing old together. But then, something started to change. It was subtle at first, so subtle that I thought I was imagining it. I'd wake up next to her in the morning, and it felt like we were two strangers sharing a bed, our bodies close but our minds a world apart. The way she spoke to me began to shift. She'd laugh at my jokes, but there was a distance behind her smile, a flicker in her eyes that I couldn't ignore. When we had dinner together, I noticed she would often look out the window, lost in thought, her mind somewhere far away. At first, I brushed it off. Life gets busy, right? Work, responsibilities, the routine of daily life, it could all take a toll on anyone. And surely, this was just a phase. I convinced myself that the spark was still there, even though it seemed harder and harder to reach. But the more I tried to reconnect, the more she seemed to pull away. It wasn't just in our conversations, either. Sarah became more distant physically. We stopped holding hands when we walked together. She no longer rested her head on my shoulder when we watched movies. The moments that once felt intimate now felt foreign. I found myself reaching out to touch her, only to have her pull away, ever so subtly, but it was enough to make my heart ache. Her responses to my attempts at affection were lukewarm at best. It felt as if she were going through the motions, but there was nothing behind them. And then there was the silence. Conversations became shorter, her answers less thoughtful. She'd retreat into her phone or laptop, spending more and more time alone, even when I was right there beside her. I noticed that she'd pick up her phone and text late at night when I was already in bed. Sometimes, I'd catch glimpses of her screen, a quick message here, a smiley face there, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy, even though I didn't have any solid reason for it. But the doubt was there, creeping into my mind, making me wonder if there was something, or someone, she wasn't telling me about. I tried to talk to her about it, of course. I asked her if something was wrong, if there was anything bothering her. She always reassured me with the same answer: nothing's wrong, I'm just tired. Work has been stressful. But it wasn't just stress. It was more than that. There was a change in her, a shift that I couldn't explain. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her. Then came the day that would change everything. It started like any other day. I was at work, going through the motions of my usual routine, but my mind was far from focused. I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking about Sarah, about her distance, her strange behavior. I had a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach, one that I couldn't ignore any longer. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like something was horribly wrong. And I knew that if I didn't figure out what it was, it would eat away at me until there was nothing left. That afternoon, I received a call from Sarah's doctor's office. They had scheduled a routine appointment for her, and I was surprised she hadn't mentioned it. I decided to go with her, just to show her that I still cared, that I was there for her. Maybe it would be a chance to talk, to bridge the gap that had been growing between us. But as soon as I arrived at the hospital, I knew something wasn't right. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't explain. That I waited in the hospital lobby as she was escorted to a back room for her appointment. It was then that I overheard something that made my blood run cold. As I sat there, scrolling through my phone, I heard a voice, her voice, whispering. I couldn't make out the entire conversation, but I distinctly caught one phrase that would haunt me forever: "I'm glad it's over." He has no clue. I froze. My heart stopped, and my blood ran icy. I couldn't comprehend what I had just heard. Was she talking about me? Who was she talking to? And what did she mean by, "It's over"? Before I could process it any further, I heard footsteps approaching. I quickly composed myself, trying to calm the rush of emotions that flooded my chest. When Sarah walked back into the lobby, her eyes were a little red, as though she had been crying. She smiled at me, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was forced, like she was putting on a mask. We didn't talk about it. We went through the motions of the rest of the day. But my mind was racing. That whisper, those words, echoed in my ears, and I knew, something was terribly wrong. That night, I decided I couldn't wait anymore. I needed to know the truth. I began my search, piecing together fragments of information, following breadcrumbs. What I uncovered shattered me completely. Sarah was having an affair. The whispers at the hospital, the late-night texts, the sudden withdrawal from our relationship, all of it made sense now. She had been seeing someone else. And worse, the truth was more painful than I could ever have imagined. She wasn't just emotionally distant. She had already emotionally checked out. She was already gone, long before I even realized it. The realization hit me like a freight train. I felt betrayed, devastated, and angry all at once. How could she do this to me? How could she lie to my face, pretend everything was fine when she was hiding a secret this huge? But it wasn't just the affair that hurt the most. It was the realization that the love I thought was so solid, so real, had been nothing more than a facade. It wasn't about the other person. It was about the truth that I hadn't seen, the cracks in our marriage that had been there all along. And now, it was too late. It started subtly. Sarah had always talked about having children, but lately, she seemed more insistent on the idea. She'd bring it up constantly, telling him that a baby was exactly what their marriage needed. "We need to start fresh," she would say. "A new chapter for us, for our love, for our family." At first, he thought it was just the typical talk that comes with the stresses of adulthood. Maybe she was looking for a distraction. But as weeks turned into months, Sarah's desire grew stronger. She even began making arrangements, secretly attending fertility consultations without telling him. It was a huge decision, and yet she was moving forward with it so quickly, with such determination. Our narrator felt a sense of dread creeping up. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that this wasn't about bringing a baby into the world but something deeper, something more complicated. It wasn't long before her behavior started to change, small things at first, her distance, the sudden late nights at work, the secretive phone calls she would quickly end whenever he entered the room. He brushed it off initially, attributing it to stress, but the nagging feeling only grew. Something was off, and he couldn't put his finger on it. Then came the day that everything changed, the moment that cracked open the facade Sarah had carefully built. It was an ordinary hospital visit, a routine checkup. Sarah had insisted that they both come along to take the first steps toward their new life, their new chapter. He was skeptical, but he went along with it, dutifully. As they sat in the sterile waiting room, his nerves began to fray. There was something in the air, something that felt wrong. Sarah seemed unusually calm, almost too calm, as if she was pretending everything was fine, when deep down, he could sense that something was unraveling. Then it happened. He overheard a conversation that would change everything. He had stepped out of the room to make a quick phone call when he overheard her whispering to someone. It was quiet enough that at first he wasn't sure he'd heard it correctly, but the words sent a chill down his spine. "I'm glad it's over." "He has no clue," Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. His blood ran cold. He didn't know who she was talking to, but one thing was clear: whatever it was something she didn't want him to know. And that thought spiraled into an overwhelming surge of suspicion. She wasn't just talking about starting fresh with a baby. No, this was about something far darker. The following days were a blur of confusion, doubt, and suspicion. His mind raced, replaying that whispered conversation over and over again. "He has no clue," the words echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. At first, he confronted Sarah gently, unsure of what to expect. "Who were you talking to at the hospital?" he asked, trying to keep his tone calm. Her response was swift and dismissive, a bit too rehearsed. "Oh, it was nothing. Just a friend checking in on me, someone I used to know." She laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but the way she avoided his gaze sent a clear signal that something wasn't right. The guilt weighed heavily on him. He didn't want to accuse her without proof, but the doubt was suffocating. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah's increasingly erratic behavior did nothing to quell his suspicions. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the constant phone calls that she'd immediately silence when he walked into the room, all of it was adding up. Something was happening behind his back, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. He started digging. Little by little, he began to piece together the fragments of Sarah's life that she'd been hiding from him. There were credit card charges he didn't recognize, mysterious gifts and flowers that she never mentioned. He found herself walking to the other room to take calls, only to hear her whispering too softly for him to make out the words. But one thing was clear: Sarah was hiding something, and it had nothing to do with their marriage. One day, he got a breakthrough. While she was at work, he decided to go through her phone. At this point, it felt like the only option. He knew it was a betrayal of trust, but he couldn't keep living in the dark. The messages were there. Messages that would turn his world upside down. He discovered the name of a man, someone Sarah had been seeing behind his back. The conversations were intimate, full of secret plans, and coded language that made it clear they were involved in something far more than just an affair. There were plans to meet, to escape. Sarah had been lying to him, lying about everything. The revelation was gut-wrenching, a shock that tore through him like a storm. She hadn't just been unfaithful, she had been planning something more sinister. She had been setting him up for something that he could never have imagined. His mind went into overdrive. What had been a faint suspicion was now a confirmed betrayal, a deliberate deception that had shaken him to his core. But in that moment, something changed within him. He wasn't just angry, he felt something else. A thirst for justice, a need to make things right. He couldn't let her get away with this, not after everything she had put him through. He decided he would make Sarah regret everything she had done. But not through anger. Not through violence. He would make her understand the cost of her betrayal, the weight of her lies, and the heartbreak she had caused him. It was time for a plan that would expose everything, a plan that would ensure she would never forget the price of her deceit. The first step was clear: he needed to confront her. He needed to make her see the truth and watch her squirm as she realized he knew everything. But this wouldn't be a typical confrontation. This would be one where she would feel the full weight of her actions. The day came. He asked Sarah to meet him in their living room. His heart pounded in his chest as he saw her walking through the door, the same woman who had promised him a fresh start. But now, there was no going back. "Sarah," he began, his voice calm but laced with bitterness, "I know everything." Her face went pale, her lips parted in shock. "What do you mean?" she stammered, her eyes darting to the door, as if searching for an escape. He pulled out his phone and showed her the messages, the proof of her affair. He watched as her expression changed, the fear creeping into her eyes. "I know about him, Sarah. I know about everything." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah tried to talk her way out of it, to deny everything, but there was no use. The truth was out, and nothing she could say would change what had been exposed. But in that moment, something unexpected happened. Instead of lashing out, instead of throwing blame, he looked at her with cold clarity. "You wanted a fresh start, didn't you? You wanted a new chapter, Sarah," he said, his voice steady and controlled. "But now, I'm starting fresh too. And this time, you won't be a part of it." Sarah's world crumbled around her. The man she thought she had under control had turned the tables, and the revenge she had never seen coming was the end of everything she had once known. As she stood there, helpless, he realized something he hadn't expected. He had regained control, not through rage, but through the quiet strength of knowing his worth. And with that, he walked away, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions, consequences that she would never forget. The lesson? Betrayal and deceit may seem to offer an easy way out, but they always come at a cost. And sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't about getting even, it's about reclaiming your life and moving forward. Then, the night came that would change everything. Sarah went into labor unexpectedly, and the couple rushed to the hospital. The rush of adrenaline was palpable as they drove through the quiet streets, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts running wild. The excitement of the moment, the birth of their child, should have been his focus, but doubts gnawed at him, like a constant itch he couldn't scratch. He tried to push them aside. This was a monumental moment, one that should have been filled with joy and anticipation. But in the back of his mind, there were questions that had been growing louder with every passing day. He couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah had been hiding something from him for a long time. It wasn't just the baby that had him unsettled. It was her. It was the way she had been acting, distant, secretive, as if something had shifted between them in ways that went far beyond the ordinary challenges of marriage. They arrived at the hospital, the sterile scent of disinfectant filling the air as they hurried through the corridors. Sarah's contractions were coming faster now, and the pain was evident on her face. But even then, the nagging feeling in his chest wouldn't let up. He tried to focus on her, to be the supportive partner she needed, but his mind kept drifting. What was she hiding? And why had everything felt so off lately? As they sat together in the waiting room, waiting for the nurses to call her in, the sterile silence of the hospital seemed to close in on him. The room was empty except for the occasional passing nurse, her footsteps echoing faintly against the tile floor. He sat there, trying to steady his breathing, trying to focus on the excitement of the moment. The baby was coming, and nothing else should have mattered. But every time he looked at Sarah, his heart sank. She was smiling, yes, but it was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her posture was stiff, and her fingers fidgeted nervously with the hem of her gown, as if she couldn't sit still, couldn't fully settle into the situation. The quiet tension between them was suffocating. They had been through so much together, but something had shifted. Something had changed. Just as his mind began to drift once again, lost in the maze of doubts and questions, it happened. The whisper, Sarah was wheeled into the delivery room by a nurse, and he stood up to follow her. As he walked past the hallway that led to the delivery rooms, he heard a voice. It wasn't his voice, and it wasn't the nurse's. It was Sarah's voice, but it was low, too soft. It was a whisper, almost like she hadn't meant for anyone to hear it. "I'm glad it's over. He has no clue." The words were so simple, yet they hit him like a punch to the gut. His heart skipped a beat, and time seemed to stand still. He stopped in his tracks, unable to move, his body frozen in place. His mind was racing, trying to process what he'd just heard. His first thought was that he had misheard her. But no, the words were clear. He had heard them unmistakably. And they didn't make sense. What was over? What did she mean? He has no clue. Was she talking about him? What was she referring to, and why had she said it like that? The hospital suddenly felt colder, the walls pressing in on him. His blood ran cold as the realization began to settle over him. This wasn't about a fresh start. It wasn't about healing their relationship. This was something far more sinister. He could feel the weight of her secret in the pit of his stomach, a secret that she had kept hidden for God knows how long. His mind began to spin. Who is she talking about? He wondered. What does she mean by, "it's over"? His thoughts churned with possibilities, none of them good. The more he tried to calm himself, the more his suspicions grew. He could no longer deny it. This wasn't some innocent desire for a fresh start. His wife had been keeping something from him, and it was bigger than he could have ever imagined. That he wanted to confront her right then and there, but something held him back. What if it was just some strange comment, some offhand remark that didn't mean anything? What if it wasn't about what he thought it was? But deep down, he knew it was. He had already seen the signs. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the odd behavior. Sarah's words were simply the confirmation he needed to understand the truth. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step back, unsure of what to do next. Should he walk away? Should he stay here, waiting for her to come out and try to keep his composure? Or should he do something about it? He knew one thing for sure, he couldn't let it slide. Not now, not after everything he had overheard. This wasn't just a small betrayal, this was something much deeper, something that had been festering for far too long. Minutes felt like hours as he wrestled with himself. Sarah was about to give birth to their child, the one thing they had both talked about for so long. He should be happy, should be excited. But instead, his world felt like it was unraveling before him. Finally, his decision was made. He couldn't wait any longer. He needed to know the truth. He needed to confront her. He wasn't going to let this moment pass, not without answers. That he walked toward the delivery room with a purpose, his mind made up. When the nurse saw him approaching, she gave him a sympathetic smile. "She's in the room now, sir. It won't be long. You can go in when she's settled." But he didn't go in right away. No, not yet. First, he had to be sure. He needed to know what she had meant, what she was hiding. He stood by the door, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on his chest. His heart raced as the seconds ticked by. Each one felt like an eternity. Inside the room, Sarah was preparing for the delivery, her face twisted in pain, her breath shallow as the contractions grew stronger. She wasn't thinking about him, not now. She was lost in the moment, focused on the baby. But he was focused on something else, on the truth. He took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Sarah's face softened when she saw him. For a moment, the tension between them seemed to ease, but he could still see it in her eyes. There was something she wasn't saying, something she was desperately trying to hide. "Sarah," he said softly, taking a step forward, "I heard you. What did you mean by, 'it's over'? Who were you talking about?" Her eyes widened in shock, and for a split second, she froze. He watched as her face shifted, the flicker of guilt crossing her expression. The look on her face told him everything he needed to know, and just like that, everything he had suspected was true. The woman he had married, the woman who had insisted on starting fresh, was keeping a secret. And in that moment, he realized something else. Whatever the secret was, whatever had been building beneath the surface for so long, it was no longer something he could ignore. His life, their life, would never be the same again. The door closed softly behind him, but the heavy weight of the truth was already crashing down on him. It was time to face whatever was coming next. The days that followed were a blur. The birth of their child should have been a joyous occasion, one that marked a new chapter in their lives, full of hope and excitement for the future. But instead, as they left the hospital and returned home, he couldn't shake the dark cloud that hovered over him. His mind kept racing back to that whisper he had overheard. He couldn't forget it. "I'm glad it's over. He has no clue." Those words gnawed at him relentlessly, twisting in his mind like a constant reminder of something that was hidden, something that would shatter the life he thought he knew. There was no time to confront Sarah in the hospital. The birth had been an overwhelming experience, with nurses bustling around and the intense emotions that came with welcoming a child into the world. But now, as they settled back into the routine of daily life, the reality of what he had heard began to take root. He couldn't ignore it any longer. As soon as they got home, he knew what he had to do. He had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The first thing he did was grab her phone. It felt like a betrayal in itself, but at this point, he wasn't thinking about the morality of his actions, he was thinking about the truth. He needed answers, and the truth was buried somewhere in the phone, hidden in plain sight. Sarah wasn't in the room at the moment. She was tending to the baby, exhausted but happy. He had a small window of time. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked her phone. He scrolled through her recent messages, her social media apps, and her call history. Nothing seemed too out of place at first. But then, he came across a message, a cryptic one, sent late at night, well after they had gone to bed. The message read, "I can't wait to see you again. I'm sorry about what happened, but I'll always be here for you. Don't worry, I'll figure it out. I promise." The words hit him like a ton of bricks. His stomach dropped as he read them over and over again. Who was Adam? Why did Sarah need to be reassured by him? And what had happened that needed so much apologizing? The message felt like a bombshell, but it was only the beginning. With his heart racing, he dug deeper. He went through her call history. There it was again, the name Adam. It was there in black and white, calls made at odd hours of the night, sometimes when he was asleep, sometimes when he was out running errands. He couldn't ignore it any longer. There were more texts, more intimate exchanges between Sarah and Adam. The connection between them was undeniable. The tension in his chest tightened with every new piece of information. His hands were shaking now, and his mind was spinning. But he couldn't stop. He needed to know more. His fingers hovered over the voicemail section of Sarah's phone, his heart in his throat. He had to know what was said. He pressed play, and the voicemail from Adam began to play. "Hey, Sarah. I can't wait to see you again. I'm sorry about what happened, but I'll always be here for you. Don't worry, I'll figure it out. I promise." Each word felt like a dagger, each promise echoing in his ears like a final blow. His thoughts scattered, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, each one confirming what he had feared. Adam wasn't just some guy. He was someone important. Someone Sarah had been seeing, and it had been going on for months, but the most devastating realization came when he dug into the deeper layers of Sarah's online life. He found messages between them, their conversations filled with affection, desire, and secrecy. They had met up multiple times, planned trips, made plans for the future. And then, he found something that sealed it all. The final, crushing piece of evidence, the baby. The one they had just welcomed into the world. The one they had brought home that very day. It wasn't his. The truth hit him like a tidal wave. The baby they had just had was not his. It was Adam's. The realization crushed him in an instant. Everything, the love, the years of their relationship, the promises they had made to each other, all of it had been a lie. He had been living in a dream while Sarah had been living in a world of secrets. This wasn't some fleeting mistake, this was an affair that had lasted for months, one that had been planned with secrecy and care. And now, here they were, with a child who was not even his. He felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. His body went cold. He sat down on the edge of their bed, the phone still in his hand, the messages staring back at him. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. How had she kept this from him? How could she lie like this? And the worst part, how had he not seen it? In that moment, everything felt surreal. The life he had built with Sarah, the dreams they had shared, the family they had planned for, it was all a lie. His world had shattered, and the weight of the betrayal was almost too much to bear. How could she do this to him? How could she do this to their family? As he sat there, feeling the crushing weight of the truth settle over him, a thought pierced through the fog of his shock. What now? There was no easy way out. No way to undo the damage. The future had changed in an instant, and there was no going back. He had two choices: confront Sarah now and deal with the fallout, or leave her and start over, with no ties to a woman who had betrayed him in the worst way possible. The room felt cold, empty. He glanced over at the crib where their newborn child lay, blissfully unaware of the turmoil that had just turned his world upside down. That child, innocent and pure, didn't deserve any of this. But neither did he. Neither did he. He knew what he had to do, and the decision wasn't going to be easy. But it was clear, he couldn't keep living this lie. Sarah had crossed a line, and now, the truth was out. The baby might not be his, but the strength he would need to move forward had to come from within. The storm that had been building for months had finally broken, and now, all he could do was pick up the pieces and figure out what came next. But one thing was certain: the life he had built with Sarah was over. And there was no turning back. The anger and pain hit him like a tidal wave. His heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice, each breath sharp and shallow. But beneath all that anger, there was something else, something darker, more calculating. It wasn't just betrayal that burned in his chest. It was a searing desire for justice. She had crossed a line, and he knew deep down that he couldn't just let this go. He couldn't let her get away with what she had done, not after everything. For a while, he was lost in a fog of emotion. The urge to confront Sarah immediately was overwhelming, but something told him that acting out of sheer anger would only lead to regret. He had to be strategic. He had to think this through. Reacting in the heat of the moment would only make him look rash, like someone who had been caught off guard, like a victim. But he wasn't going to be a victim. No, he was going to be the one in control of this situation. He was going to turn the tables. As he sat there, stewing in his thoughts, the plan began to take shape. Slowly, methodically, he crafted his revenge. The first thing he needed to do was gather more information, to solidify his understanding of what had truly been going on. He wasn't going to let Sarah think she could simply walk away from this with no consequences. He wasn't going to give her a chance to deny what she had done. The truth had to come out in its entirety, and it had to come from him. He knew that her guilt, her shame, those emotions would eat away at her as she tried to keep her secret buried. But he would expose it all, expose it in a way that would leave no room for excuses. The first step of his plan was to secure evidence, irrefutable, undeniable proof. He didn't trust just her phone anymore. No, he needed more. He needed to dig deeper, to get to the heart of it all. And that's when he made the decision to hire a private investigator. The idea came to him in a flash, and once it settled in, he knew it was the right move. The investigator could find things that he couldn't, things he had no access to. The private investigator was a professional, someone who had worked on high-profile cases before. It didn't take long for the investigator to get to work. The first thing he did was focus on Adam. Who was this man? What did he know? What was his connection to Sarah? The investigator dug into Adam's life, uncovering details that would later prove invaluable. They traced his whereabouts, followed his movements, and got access to his personal records. He didn't know everything, but he knew enough. Adam had been in and out of the picture for months, someone who had wormed his way into Sarah's life without him even realizing it. The investigator uncovered Adam's address, his routine, and even information about his job. Adam wasn't just some casual affair partner, he was a man with a life of his own, someone who had been manipulating Sarah, drawing her into a web of lies and deceit. But it wasn't just about Adam. It was about Sarah and the life she had built with him while he was kept in the dark, playing the fool. He wanted to know everything he could about Adam, every weakness, every flaw, every secret. He needed to understand the enemy before he could strike. Armed with this knowledge, he began to formulate his first move. This wasn't going to be about yelling, about confronting Sarah head-on, no. It was about psychological warfare. It was about showing her the consequences of her actions in a way that would haunt her forever. He wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of knowing that she had broken him. He was going to break her in a way she'd never forget, in a way that would leave her questioning every decision she had ever made. The first step in his revenge was to put the fear of loss into Adam. Sarah had been so careful, so secretive, thinking she could get away with everything. But now, he had the power. He wasn't going to act recklessly, though. No, he was going to be calculated and smart. The private investigator had found Adam's workplace, a high-end, exclusive law firm that boasted top clients. Adam had been living a life of privilege, using his connections and charm to avoid getting caught. The investigator had found out about Adam's colleagues, his personal ties to the firm, and even some of the unsavory dealings he had been involved in. The plan? Simple. The investigator would anonymously send a series of tips to Adam's law firm, tips that would expose his misconduct. The firm had a zero-tolerance policy when it came to dishonesty and unethical behavior, and the tips painted a picture of Adam's questionable actions. He didn't want to ruin Adam's life completely, no, that would be too easy. But he wanted to make Adam uncomfortable, to put his life in a position where his secrets were about to come to light. He would create doubt in Adam's professional life, just enough to make him question whether his position at the firm was truly secure. It wasn't just about revenge on Adam, though. It was about sending a message to Sarah, showing her that the consequences of her actions were already starting to ripple outward. The affair, her lies, her betrayal, it all had repercussions, and they were going to come crashing down on her. The next phase of the plan was the most delicate. He had to ensure that Sarah felt the full weight of her actions, that she understood the depth of her betrayal. He knew she'd never expect it, and that's what made it so perfect. He began subtly manipulating their interactions. He acted normal on the surface, but he made sure to plant seeds of doubt in her mind. He started to drop hints, small comments here and there, about Adam. He would mention how strange it was that she'd received so many late-night calls. He'd comment on how Adam seemed to be in the background of their lives more than he realized. Nothing overt, just little things that would make her uneasy. Soon enough, Sarah began to pick up on the subtle shifts in his behavior. She'd ask questions, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Is everything okay? You've been acting different. He'd always reassure her, but the cracks were beginning to form. She could feel the tension, the change, and it unnerved her. She had no idea what was coming, no idea that the web she had woven was about to come undone, but the best part of the plan, the part that would hit Sarah the hardest, came later. Once Adam's professional life had been shaken up, he'd been pushed out of his firm, just a tiny nudge, but enough to rattle him. It would be the perfect moment to confront Sarah, to let her know that everything she had done was about to fall apart. He wasn't going to throw a fit. He wasn't going to scream. No, he was going to calmly tell her that he knew everything, every detail. He was going to let her know that the man she had been seeing was no longer safe, that his life was on the brink of destruction. And when she realized what had happened to Adam, she'd know that it was just the beginning. Her world was about to come crashing down too, but that moment wasn't here yet. Not just yet. He had to be patient. He had to let it unfold, piece by piece. Every step was carefully calculated. His revenge wasn't going to be quick, it wasn't going to be a loud explosion of fury. No, it was going to be a slow burn, one that would torment Sarah every day, making her feel like she was being slowly consumed by her own guilt. She'd never see it coming. And that was the beauty of it. The day had finally arrived. The tension had been building for weeks, and now, everything was about to come to a head. Sarah was out running errands, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to shake her world to its core. He was at home, pacing back and forth, his heart pounding in his chest. The private investigator had done their part, sending him a photo of Adam's car parked outside a local coffee shop. The time had come. He had everything in place. With a deep breath, he grabbed his keys and left the house. As he drove through the quiet streets, the weight of the moment began to settle in. He wasn't just about to confront a man who had betrayed him, he was about to shatter Adam's life, just as Sarah had shattered his. The road seemed endless, and every minute felt like an eternity. But soon, he arrived at the coffee shop, a small, inconspicuous place tucked away on a corner, the kind of place where people went to escape the noise of the world. Through the large windows, he could see Adam sitting alone, casually sipping on his coffee. He looked so innocent, so completely unaware of the chaos that was about to consume him. Adam was lost in his own thoughts, completely oblivious to the fact that his life was about to be turned upside down. To him, this was just another morning, just another cup of coffee. But to the husband, this was everything. He stepped inside, his heart thudding in his chest. The bell on the door jingled as he walked in, and Adam looked up. At first, there was no recognition in his eyes, just the casual glance of someone who didn't think they had any reason to be concerned. But as the husband moved toward him, a cold, calculated look on his face, Adam's expression shifted. He leaned forward slightly, still unsure of what was happening, but something in the air had changed. "I think you know who I am," the husband said, his voice steady, almost eerie in its calmness. The words hung in the air between them, and Adam's face slowly began to drain of color. He didn't say anything at first, he didn't need to. The recognition was immediate. The husband could see it in Adam's eyes, the flicker of realization. The man had been caught. He was cornered. He wasn't just facing an angry husband anymore, he was facing the consequences of his own actions, and he knew they were about to come crashing down on him. Adam opened his mouth to speak, but the husband cut him off, his voice hard, almost mechanical. "I know everything. You've been sleeping with my wife. And now, I'm going to make sure you regret it." The words hit Adam like a slap in the face. His breath hitched, and for a moment, he seemed to lose his grip on reality. His eyes darted around, as if looking for an escape, but he knew there was no way out. The truth was out in the open. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Everything he had done, every secret, every betrayal, it was all laid bare in front of this man who now controlled the narrative. Before Adam could respond, the husband reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. He slid it across the table with deliberate precision, as though the action itself was a warning. Adam stared at the phone, his pulse quickening. His hand trembled as he reached for it, knowing that what he was about to see was the beginning of the end. The husband leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving Adam's face. He didn't need to speak anymore. The phone was the proof, irrefutable, undeniable. It was the smoking gun, the final blow. Adam hesitated for a moment, then clicked on the recording. His face went even paler as the voice from the phone filled the space between them. It was Sarah's voice, clear and unmistakable, talking to him, laughing, whispering sweetly. There were moments of intimacy, of shared secrets, of promises made in the dark. Then came the real kicker, the conversations about their plans, their meetings, the things they had done. There was even a recording of a meeting at a hotel, the sound of their voices unmistakable. Adam's own words played through the speakers, words of affection, of desire. There was no mistaking it. This wasn't some harmless flirtation, it was a full-blown affair, one that had lasted far too long and gone far too deep. "I've been recording you for weeks," the husband said, his voice steady and cold. "Every conversation, every meeting, every lie you've told, it's all right here." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of the situation settle in. Adam was frozen, his face contorting in panic as he listened to the damning evidence. He had no defense, no way to talk his way out of this. His life, his reputation, his career, all of it was about to implode. "You think this is over?" the husband continued, his eyes narrowing. "This is just the beginning. This is going to be public. Your life is about to fall apart, Adam. You're going to lose everything. Your job. Your reputation. Your relationships. And I'm going to make sure of it." Adam opened his mouth, but the words failed him. He wanted to beg, to apologize, to make some excuse, but nothing could undo what had already been done. The husband's voice was like ice as he spoke again, "You'll never see me coming. You'll never know where the next blow will land. But trust me, it's coming. And when it does, it will be everything you've ever feared. I'm going to ruin you, Adam. And you'll never be able to escape it." There was no bravado left in Adam now. His shoulders slumped, and the color had drained from his face entirely. His eyes darted around, but no words came out. He was defeated, broken in an instant. And as the husband stood up from the table, leaving Adam to stew in his misery, he knew that he had just set the stage for Sarah's eventual downfall. With one final glance at Adam, the husband walked away from the coffee shop, the cold air outside hitting his skin like a wave. But he didn't feel the chill. He felt something far colder inside, a sense of power, of control. He had made the first move, and it had worked. Adam's life was in tatters, and soon, Sarah's would be too. The revenge wasn't over. Far from it. This was just the beginning. The final piece of his plan was, by far, the hardest. Confronting Sarah was something he had been putting off, not because he feared the confrontation itself, but because he had to do it with cold, surgical precision. He couldn't afford to let emotion take over. He had to remain calm, unshakable. He had already unraveled Adam's life, but this was the ultimate moment. The moment where the entire facade Sarah had so carefully built around their lives would come crashing down. It wasn't just about her betrayal anymore. It was about ensuring that she understood the consequences of her actions, about making her face the full weight of what she had done. And so, he waited. He waited until the night, after everything had settled. The house was quiet, the baby asleep in its crib, Sarah finally home after running errands. She walked into the living room, a smile on her face, her eyes filled with a kind of naive joy. She looked at him, and for a brief second, everything seemed normal. But then, she paused. Something about the way he was sitting, something about his stillness, it was different. There was a tension in the air, something she couldn't quite place, but it unsettled her. She smiled weakly, holding the baby close to her chest. "Hey, everything okay?" He didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, his expression unreadable, his eyes cold, betraying none of the pain or anger that had once consumed him. The storm inside him had calmed to a steady, simmering rage, but he wasn't going to let it spill out of him. He would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. He had control now. "I know everything," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between them, chilling the warmth of the room. She froze. The smile faltered, slipping from her face as her eyes searched his, desperate for an explanation, for some clue that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't uncovered the truth. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. "No," she finally said, her voice shaking, "What do you mean?" He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly reached into the pocket of his jacket, pulling out a folder. The rustle of paper was deafening in the silence of the room. Her eyes widened as he placed it in front of her. She stared at it for a long moment, her pulse quickening, her breath shallow, before finally picking it up with trembling hands. Inside the folder were the photos, the messages, the details from the private investigator's report, all the damning evidence that she had been trying so hard to keep hidden. The messages were printed out, showing intimate conversations, plans for secret meetings, texts that dripped with deceit. The photos were of her and Adam, her smile innocent, her body language giving away nothing, but to him, they screamed betrayal. He watched her face as she sifted through the evidence, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched the hope leave her eyes. At first, she didn't speak. Her lips quivered, and her eyes flicked back and forth, trying to process what she was seeing. She looked up at him, as if searching for some sign that this was all a mistake. But it wasn't. He wasn't mistaken. He wasn't imagining it. She had betrayed him, and now, it was all laid bare. Her breath caught as she finally spoke. I didn't think you'd understand. Her voice wavered, the cracks in her facade beginning to show. I thought I needed something more. Something better. He had been expecting this. The excuses. The explanations. But none of it mattered now. None of it would undo what had happened. He had heard every word, every plea, every justification, and he knew that there was nothing she could say that would change the truth. I did it for us, she said, her voice trembling now. She was desperate, reaching for any justification that might save her. I thought if we had a baby, everything would be okay. That it would fix things, fix us. But I needed something more, something I wasn't getting from you. Her tears were flowing now, her face contorted in anguish. She was unraveling in front of him, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for her to cry, for her to apologize. The damage was already done. Something more, he repeated, his voice cold and hard. The anger bubbled just beneath the surface, but he held it in check. You thought this would fix things? Destroying everything we had, lying to me, hiding behind a fake life, that's how you thought you could fix it? Her lip quivered, but she didn't answer. The weight of her actions, the gravity of what she had done, was finally sinking in. The excuses had stopped. There was nothing left to say. I thought you'd never understand, she whispered, looking down at the photos again, as though they could somehow undo the pain they had caused. She shook her head, trying to piece together the fragments of her words. I thought you'd never know. But I just wanted to be happy. I didn't know how to make you happy anymore, so I found someone who could. The realization of it all hit him in waves. It wasn't just the affair itself that stung. It was the complete dismantling of everything he had thought was true about their marriage. She hadn't just been unfaithful physically, she had betrayed his trust, his belief in her, in them. She had believed that a new life, a new chapter would somehow fix everything, without ever considering the damage she was doing in the process, but her words were hollow. The moment the evidence had been laid bare, her pleas lost all power. There was nothing she could do to erase what she had done. There was no way to turn back time. There was no fix. He stood up then, his body tense, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The damage is done, Sarah. You can't just erase it. You can't just sweep it under the rug with your excuses. The baby, blissfully unaware of the conversation taking place, stirred in her arms, but Sarah couldn't focus on that. The baby, the very life they had just brought into the world, wasn't the symbol of new beginnings anymore. Instead, it became the reflection of everything that had been lost. I can't even look at you right now, he muttered, his voice breaking for the first time. Not from emotion, but from the weight of the betrayal. You've taken everything from us. The love we had, the trust, the family. He turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing through the silent house. She didn't try to stop him. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The next few days were a blur. Sarah tried to salvage what she could, pleading for forgiveness, promising that things would be different. But he knew better now. There was no going back. The facade had crumbled, and with it, everything they had built. He would never forget the moment she stood before him, begging for his understanding, her broken heart laid bare. But in the end, all he could feel was the cold emptiness of knowing that, in the pursuit of something better, she had destroyed everything they had. And that was something he could never forgive. As the truth unfolded, the world around him seemed to unravel at the same pace. The life he had worked so hard to build, the marriage that he had believed in, had all been shattered in the blink of an eye. Sarah's attempts to salvage their relationship were futile. No matter how much she pleaded, no matter how many tears she shed, the damage was irreversible. Trust, once broken, could never be repaired. She had taken the most sacred part of their bond and stomped on it, and no amount of words could ever fix that. She spent days apologizing, trying to convince him that it was a mistake, that it wasn't about him, that she had just gotten lost. But those excuses fell on deaf ears. Every apology was just another reminder of the lies, another reminder of the man she had chosen over him. She begged him to understand that her affair was not about a lack of love for him, but a need for something she couldn't articulate. She said she had felt unappreciated, unnoticed, like a shadow in their own life together. But that wasn't the point. He had been there, present, willing to fight for their future. But she hadn't been. She had gone behind his back, made decisions without him, and thrown their relationship away. At first, the husband was consumed by grief, and the pain of betrayal overwhelmed him. He couldn't escape the suffocating weight of it all. The memories of their good times together felt like a cruel joke, as he realized that none of it had been real in the way he had thought. The love they had shared was tainted by lies, deceit, and hidden agendas. But as the days dragged on, something inside him began to shift. He had allowed the grief to take hold of him for too long. He couldn't stay in that dark place forever. His mind began to clear, and with clarity came strength. He knew that he couldn't stay in this broken state. He had to move forward. Sarah had stolen his peace, his trust, and his happiness, but he would not allow her to steal his future. He took control of his life with the determination of someone who had been through the fire and emerged stronger. The anger, the hurt, it was all still there, but he refused to let it consume him any longer. His future was his to claim, not hers. And so, with every passing day, he reclaimed a piece of himself. He started to focus on what was next, on what he could build for himself, without her. He sought therapy, spent time with his friends, and leaned into his passions, things he had put aside while he had been wrapped up in his marriage. Slowly, he began to heal. His revenge, though, was not rooted in violence or petty retaliation. It wasn't about hurting her the way she had hurt him. No, his revenge was more profound, more lasting. His revenge was about living a life that was completely separate from her, one where he thrived, where he found happiness and success, and where he was in control of his own destiny. He would no longer be defined by her betrayal. He would define himself on his own terms. He focused on his career, making strides that he hadn't thought possible when he was tangled up in the suffocating web of his marriage. He reached out to people he had lost touch with and rekindled old friendships that brought him joy. He found solace in his own company and began to explore new hobbies that gave him fulfillment and peace of mind. He started traveling, enjoying the freedom that came with being able to go anywhere he wanted, whenever he wanted. Every step he took, every new venture, every experience, he was reclaiming his life from the ashes Sarah had left behind. But the real victory came in the quiet moments, when he would reflect on his journey. There was a time when he thought he wouldn't survive the pain, when he thought he would never be whole again. But with each new day, he saw that he was healing, becoming stronger, and realizing that the life he had once envisioned with Sarah was no longer the life he wanted. And Sarah? She was left to pick up the pieces of her own life, now torn apart by her own decisions. The affair, the lies, and the betrayal had destroyed everything she had built with him. She tried to move on, but she would never forget the man she had wronged, the man who had been willing to give her everything, only to be repaid with deception. She would always carry the burden of knowing that she had broken something precious. Meanwhile, the husband had emerged victorious in a way that was beyond any kind of petty revenge. His victory was the reclamation of his dignity, his self-worth, and his future. He had been betrayed in the most painful way possible, but he had not let that define him. Instead, he had turned that pain into power, strength, and growth. In the end, his revenge wasn't about causing harm. It wasn't about hurting Sarah the way she had hurt him. No, his revenge was far more profound. It was about rebuilding his life, finding happiness, and becoming the best version of himself, free from the shadow of betrayal. He had taken back control of his own destiny, and nothing, could take that away from him. That he walked away from that chapter of his life with his head held high, knowing that he had come out on top. He had faced the ultimate betrayal, but instead of allowing it to break him, he had used it as fuel to build something far greater. The past was gone, and now he was focused on the future, one that he would create, and no one would ever have the power to destroy again.